What's up, everybody? Welcome back, Corey Hughes Bloody History. So today we're going to start to go over, I don't know if we're going to do the whole thing, but we've got George de Mohrenschildt's manuscript of I'm a Patsy, I'm a Patsy. Obviously written about Lee Harvey Oswald. It's pretty long. This is like 200 pages, so I don't think we're definitely not going to do it all today. And what's going to determine if we get through all of it or not is if it's any interesting or not. So we're definitely going to start it today. We'll probably do it again tomorrow unless this thing is just boring, right? So, but I didn't even know that George de Mohrenschildt had a manuscript, and here it is. So there's no actual print copies available. Maybe I might print it myself. So, let's begin. I'm a Patsy, I'm a Patsy. Preface in Haiti. I'm a Patsy, I'm a Patsy. These last words of my friend Lee Harvey Oswald still ring in my ears and make me think of the terrible injustice inflicted on the memory of this, quote, supposed assassin. November 1963 was fairly uneventful in Haiti. No shootings and no invasions. My young geologist, Alston Boyd, and I had worked in our office located on Avenue Truman in the center of Port-au-Prince. Since we started very early in the morning to avoid the infernal daily heat, our daily chores were over at 2 p.m. This office occupied a large room in the Quonset building belonging to the Haitian government, and we were kept there virtually incommunicado since it contained government maps and other strategic information. Alston and I drove to my house overlooking Port-au-Prince in the area called Tonton-Lisle and a block away from the presidential retreat. Then we ate and took a siesta like any self-respecting Haitian. Then later the afternoon we dressed and went to the reception at the Lebanese embassy. The usually animated streets of the capital seemed deserted. I feel trouble in the air, said my wife Jean. The air was balmy. The soldiers in Tonton's Makuts were absent, and we could not hear any shots. We greeted the Lebanese ambassador and joined the crowd. George Morel, head of the Pan American Airways in Haiti, came up to us immediately. Didn't you know your president was killed? He asked in a strained voice. At first we thought he was talking about the president of Haiti, Dr. Francois Duvalier, who was my nominal boss in Haiti. Seeking out blank expressions, Morel explained, President Kennedy was assassinated today. I hoped that it wouldn't happen in Texas and especially in Dallas, but Morel summarily explained the situation, and it was in Dallas. Gloomily, we filed out of the Lebanese embassy, where people did not seem to be too badly concerned about President Kennedy's fate, got in the car and drove away. If had his Tonton Makuts around, this would not have happened, I said angrily, and this was my first serious criticism of our services supposed to protect the President of the United States. We drove gloomily to the American Embassy, located near the seashore and not too far from my office. The doors were wide open, and two Marines stood there on both sides of a book where the American residents would sign their name as a gesture of reverence to the dead head of state. Having signed our names, we were the first to have done it. We drove to the house of an old friend of mine, Valentin Teddy Block, Blaque, an attaché at the embassy. Teddy's house was similar to ours, but more elaborate, with large terrace overlooking the sparkling bay of Port-au-Prince. Several mutual friends stood around looking at each other with stunned expressions and seems to ask the same question, why him? For the first time we had a president who was young and energetic, and he was trying to solve the problems of the world, said Jean sadly, holding back her tears, and he had to go. The beautiful view seemed unreal to us as we stood there silently. And in Dallas I mused aloud, why there, a conservative and somewhat provincial city, but successful and proud of its success? We knew the mayor, a charming man, and many city fathers. But who did it? I asked Teddy. I just listened to the radio, and a suspect was arrested already, he said. Before he mentioned the name, I thought of Lee and his rifle with the telescopic lens. Could it be Lee? No, it was impossible. And driving back home in stunned silence, we thought of Lee and the predicament he was in. But since the official version had it that Lee Harvey Oswald was the main suspect, we made our deposition at the embassy. We did know him, and we were aware of the fact that he owned a rifle. We would be happy to testify what we knew about him and about our relationship with him and his wife. But we did not believe he was the assassin. Then we learned that a letter was sent by some influential in Washington to the officials of the Haitian government to drop me from the payroll and to exile me as fast as possible. Fortunately, I had good friends, and the latter did not happen. And later, little by little, we were ostracized by the United States Ambassador Timmons, then by the American businessmen and government employees with whom we had been very good terms, and finally came the news of the investigation of all our friends and even acquaintances in the United States. Then came the man with the white teeth and the flannel suit, an FBI agent trying to scare us off. At last, after a long time, we were officially invited to come to Washington and help the Warren Committee in their investigation. Although we could contribute very little, we still accepted to go to Washington and testify. Although our depositions were supposed to remain confidential, all the 300 pages of irrelevant conversation were printed and promiscuously distributed. Actually, our depositions were longer than Marina's and Mrs. Marguerite Oswald's put together. Why? We assumed two reasons: to waste taxpayers' money and to distract attention of the American people from the people involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. All the gossipy, futile stuff related to our private lives, half of it not relevant to Oswald, boring and useless, and all this because my wife and I liked Lee Harvey Oswald. Tried to defend him, and because Lee said before he died, I liked and admired George de Mohrenschildt. Getting to know Lee Harvey Oswald and his wife. Early in the summer of 1962, the rumors spread out among the Russian people of Dallas and Fort Worth of an unusual couple, the Oswalds. He was supposedly an ex-Marine, an unfriendly and eccentric character who had gone to Russia and brought back with him a Russian wife. He had lives in Minsk, where I had spent my early childhood, and so I was curious to meet the couple to find out what had happened to Minsk. Someone gave me Lee's address, and one afternoon a friend of mine, Colonel Lawrence Orloff, and myself drove to Fort Worth, about 30 miles from Dallas. We drove over the dreary, sewage-smelling miles separating the two cities. Texas does have lovely open spaces, but here they were degraded and polluted. After some searching, we found a shack on Mercedes Street in a semi-industrial slummy area near Montgomery Ward. I knocked, and a tawdry but clean young woman opened the door. I introduced myself and the colonel, giving a reference the name of George Bowie, Bouhe, from whom I obtained the address. George was an elderly refuge, very friendly, the father superior of all the Russians in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so this was Marina Oswald. To Orlov, she was beautiful notwithstanding bad teeth and mousy blonde hair. I did not find her very attractive, although she had certain charm and she spoke beautiful, melodious Russian, so different from the language used by us who anglicized our language and bastardized it by foreign intonations and words. Marina offered us some sherry and said that Lee would be over soon. We spoke a little, fooling around. She had a pretty good sense of humor, but the opinions she expressed seemed trite to me. And then entered Lee Harvey Oswald, who was to become so famous or infamous. He wore overalls and clean working man's shoes on. Only someone who had never met Lee could have called him insignificant. There was something outstanding about this man, I told myself. One could detect immediately a very sincere and forward man. Although he was average-looking, with no outstanding features of medium size, he showed in his conversation all the elements of concentration, thought, and toughness. This man had the courage of convictions and did not hesitate to discuss them. I was glad to meet such a person, and was carried away back to the days of my youth in Europe, where as students we discussed world affairs and our own ideas over many beers and without caring about time. Lee was looking tenderly from time to time at baby June. He loved her. We shook hands and left. Driving back, the colonel mused, "She is so charming and young." "But I found the ex-Marine so much more interesting," I said. My friend, the retired Air Force colonel, resented Lee. His offhandedness, his ironic smiles, and especially his ferocious spirit of independence. All his sympathy went to Marina, the poor Russian refugee. We spoke English first, and then somehow we switched to Russian. Lee spoke it very well, only with a slight accent. Marina did not say very much. "Doesn't your wife speak any English at all?" I asked Lee. No, and I don't want her to know English. I want her to continue speaking her own language. Russian is beautiful, and I don't want to forget it. And he added with deep conviction, Russian literature is marvelous, and the people I met in the Soviet Union were so warm and nice to me. Yes, I made many friends there, he added thoughtfully. And how about the Soviet government, I asked anxiously. Well, that's another story. The trouble with me, I always look for an ideal which probably does not exist. Maybe your friend does not understand Russian, said Lee, looking at Colonel Orloff. Let's speak English then. You know I was a Marine, and I have respect for the brass. He smiled and added a few kind words to my friend. And then it was time for us to go. My wife speaks Russian also, and she would like to spend some time with you, Marina, and the baby, of course, I said. I would like to, but it will depend on Lee, she answered humbly. I am sure Lee will let you go and will come himself. A bond of friendship was already formed between the two of us. First meeting with Lee. Lee called me a few days after our trip to Fort Worth. Marina and I will come over tonight, if you don't mind, he said. Maybe I could drive to Fort Worth and drive you, I asked. No, thank you. We will come by bus, he answered laconically. And here they were, Marina, Lee, and the baby June. We lived at the time in a pleasant area called University Park, a few blocks from the Southern Methodist University, a conservative stronghold. Both my wife and I were fairly free at the time and welcomed our guests, so different from the local society. Jean liked Marina immediately and offered to help with her English. Yes, I have to know the language. She agreed, and then, unexpectedly, people already asked me why I liked Lee, and her eyes darted about the furniture and decoration of our rather modest home, and I answered them, why did Lee like me? Jean liked this humble remark, and to her, sympathy for Marina increased. In the meantime, Lee and I sat on a comfortable sofa and talked all evening. Naturally, I do not remember the sequence, although I recorded what I remembered a few years later. But mostly I asked questions, and he answered them. Naturally, I wanted to know what made him go to the Soviet Union, and he answered by telling me of his youth in New Orleans. Since his childhood, he was keenly aware of social and racial injustices. Instead of playing basketball or baseball like any other red-blooded American youth, he read voraciously. Among the books he read was Marx's The Capital, which made a deep impression on him. Ironically, he said, he borrowed this book from the Loyola University Library. What did you like in it? I remember asking him. It made clear to me the intolerable fact of the exploitation of the poor by the rich. But I said, Lee, you must have seen it all over the world. The weak or the poor are exploited everywhere by the powerful and the rich. Listen to this. 2 dogs meet on the cross point between East and West Berlin. One dog is running away from the capitalism, the other from communism. The capitalist dog asks, why do you run away? Because I can eat, but I cannot bark. Why are you running away? If I bark, I cannot eat, answered the capitalist dog. Lee laughed and answered by a joke he had heard somewhere in Minsk. As you know, he said, Russians grab all the can from the satellite countries. So one day at the meeting of the Communist Party in Romania, one of the workers stood up and said, Comrade Secretary, may I ask you 3 questions? Go ahead. I want to know what happened to our wheat, our petroleum, and our wine. Well, said the secretary, it's a very complex economic question, and I cannot answer it immediately. Well, a few months later, the workers are holding the same type of meeting, and another comrade raises his hand and says, Comrade Secretary, may I ask you 4 questions? Shoot, says the secretary. I want to ask you what happened to our petroleum, wine, and wheat, and also what happened to the comrade who asked the 3 questions some time ago. Silence. We both laughed. At least here we are not being sent to a concentration camp, I said. You are wrong, answered Lee seriously. Most of the prisoners, convicts in American jail are political prisoners. They are victims of the system. I read similar opinions recently in several liberal books, and Lee was way ahead in thought of all of them. This was over 14 years ago. I remember concluding this conversation by telling Lee, if you want to be a revolutionary, you have to be a fool or have to have an inspiration. And your actions will be judged by the success or failure of your life. Lee agreed. What I liked about him was that he was a seeker for justice, that he had highly developed social instincts, and I was disappointed in my own children for the lack of such instincts. Incidentally, I remember some details pretty well because I made notes of them later and also made tapes of my recollections fairly soon after the assassination. That night, Gene served a Russian dinner, which Marina found delicious, but Lee hardly touched. He was ascetic in his habits, was indifferent to food, didn't like desserts. In the meantime, baby June slept quietly in bed, all wrapped up. Lee looked tenderly at her. That night, we learned a lot about him. He neither drank or smoked, and objected if others, especially his wife, did. Since neither my wife or I smoked and drank very little, he liked it and considered that we were on his side. Gene was appalled to find out that baby June hadn't had any injections usually given to a child. Also, Marina would pick up the pacifier from the floor and then tried it herself before putting it in June's mouth. Unfortunately, she had infected teeth at the time, and so the baby was also exposed. My wife had high ideas on Russian hygiene and generally on the high standards of the Soviet youth, so she was outspokenly critical. Your infected teeth have to be removed as soon as possible, she told Marina. When Marina objected that she didn't have any money and couldn't speak English, Jean promised to help her. After dinner, Lee and I went back on the sofa and renewed our conversation. I served in the Marine Corps not because I was a patriot, but I wanted to get away from the drudgery and to see the world, admitted Lee. Did you like the service? Not particularly, but I had time to study, to read, and indeed we traveled a lot. You told me you lived in Japan. How did you land there? Just an accident of the Marine Corps duty. The military duty was boring and stupid, but fortunately I moved around, began visiting places where youngsters meet and establish contacts with some more progressive and thinking Japanese. And this, said Lee thoughtfully, is what led me to Russia eventually. I also learned there of other Japanese ways of exploitation of the poor by the rich, semi-feudal industrial giants which act paternalistically, yet exploiting the workers, the proletariats. The wages in Japan were ridiculously low, Lee said. Well, it's changing now, said I. Say, Lee, it's in Japan that you got your discharge from the Marine Corps. Lee did not like to elaborate on this touchy subject. I had to work to support my mother. But it developed later, as we all know, that he did not go back to the USA to support his mother, but changed his mind and instead went to Russia. He obviously used the money obtained at his discharge for this trip. He first went to Western Europe and then drifted to the USSR via Finland, if I remember well. Later on, Lee's honorable discharge was changed to undesirable discharge, and he hated to talk about it and considered it unfair to him. This explains his hatred of Connolly, who was Secretary of the Navy at the time of this change of Lee's discharge. But that day he did not discuss this subject and went on talking about Russia. I got to Moscow and stayed there until the Russians had confidence in me and gave me a permit to work. He did not mention that he tried to commit suicide in desperation and cut his wrists. Marine took part in the conversation. Lee, you threw your passport in the face of the American consul and said you denounced your citizenship, she said. Later, Lee talked to me about his ordeal in Moscow, but not this time. He went talking about his impressions of Minsk because he knew I was interested in this subject. He gave me a general description of the city I knew from my early childhood. I was assigned to work there without any particular reason in a TV factory, possibly because I had a little electronic training in the Marines, he said candidly. Tell me more about the countryside, I asked him. Swisslock River is pretty clean. We used to go by rowboats to the forest nearby to picnic on weekends. The forests are beautiful there, huge pine trees, clean grass, full of berries of all kinds. I remember the cathedral, several other picturesque churches, and the main building, GPU, NKVD, and KGB police headquarters, where my father spent several months and where he almost died of starvation and was finally sentenced to life in exile in Siberia. But these were childhood memories, and resentment on my part had disappeared. He gave me a perfect description of all these landmarks. They were still there, unchanged, but there were many new factories built, one of them where he worked. Did you like your job? Not particularly, but the pay was sufficient. About 100 rubles a month, an average for the Soviet Union. I could live on it. My apartment and all utilities were furnished by the factory for a nominal fee, as well as medical insurance. He gave me the prices of bread, produce, milk, etc., which were reasonable, and of clothing, which were outrageously high. Sometimes I used to run short of meat, but I'm not a big eater. It was of no importance to me. Marina listened in and gave more precise information, especially complaining about clothing and shoes. She was a practical one. You must have been somewhat privileged, I said, being a foreigner, but how did the other workers live in Minsk, the Russians? Not too well, usually one roof for a couple community kitchens and lavatories, he admitted. This led to quarrels, gossip, jealousy, a rather dismal situation, but what does it matter if everyone is in the same boat, if everyone suffers? No rich exploiters like here, no great contrast between the rich and poor. Butter and meat were out of my reach, said Marina bitterly, but you foreigners could afford these luxuries. She was ready to continue talking more, but since she was from Smolensk, then the town I was not familiar with, I asked Lee to talk more about Minsk, and he did. To me, his descriptions were most touching. That night, Marina announced that Lee was going to be laid off from his job in Fort Worth at Leslie Welding Company. If I remember correctly, it was a poor job anyway, minimal wages, long hours, unhealthy conditions, but Lee did not complain. He never complained. It was Marina who constantly was dissatisfied. The air of American prosperity bothered her. She was envious of other people's wealth or well-being. Lee's mind was of stoic, philosophical type. That's why I guessed he had gotten along so well with other Russians he met in the Soviet Union. Russians did not mind to suffer and even go hungry if they can spend entire nights talking and speculating on some esoteric matters. Next time the Oswalds came to visit us, we began speaking of Minsk again. I reminisced that when I was 5 years old, my father used to take me to the forest, and I helped him as well as I could in his awkward efforts to cut down a big pine tree. It was a tough job for my father, who never had been a physically able man, and he constantly hurt himself. Once he jammed his finger so badly, the bone broke and the finger remained useless for the rest of his life. Surprisingly, I grew adept at that sort of thing and was quite agreeable with an axe. Is that lovely forest north of town still in existence? I asked Lee. And I explained where it was. Yes, we used to go there frequently by bus with my fellow workers. We took food along and spent the whole day talking freely. I explained the United States to them, and they informed me on life in Russia. Lee generally did not complain about his life in Russia, but Marina did very frequently. Sincerely or not, I do not know. She considered me a capitalist and tried to please me. I promised Lee that night to give him introductions to a few influential people, since I wanted him and his family to move away from the gruesome of Fort Worth slum. I hoped that the other members of the Russian community would help him also, and told him so. Thanks a lot. I can take care of myself. I don't need those creeps. I shall find something, he answered gruffly. This was an example of Lee's independence. He refused help, objected even to my help. Rather than to be indebted to someone, he would rather starve on his own. While Marina was usually a lot of fun, laughed easily, but did not say anything that would make you think, Lee was serious and did not take life as a joke. But if he happened to be in good mood, he became an excellent companion, remembered political jokes, told them well, and laughed at yours. Do you know this one about the American tourist carrying a small transistor radio in Moscow? Lee asked me. No, I don't know the story. Well, the Muscovites stopped the American and said, "We make them much better than you do. What is it?" We both laughed. Then I countered and asked Lee, "What's the difference between the capitalism and the socialism?" Lee did not know. Capitalism makes social mistakes and socialism makes capital mistakes. A Russian commissar is asked at the holy gates where he would like to go, to a capitalist hell or to a communist hell, said Lee. The commissar answers, "I would like to go to a capitalist hell. I'm so tired of the communist hell." Then I told Lee a few foolish jokes about Kennedy. They were very, and then something's cut off here, P.O. President Kennedy tells a group of businessmen the economic situation is so good that if I weren't your president, I would invest in the stock market right now. And the businessmen answered in unison, so would we if you were not our president. Both laughed. Kennedy had a terrible nightmare. He wakes up Jackie. "Honey, what a terrible thing. I dreamed I was spending my own money, not government's." Again we laughed, but without resentment. We both liked President Kennedy, so I finished my foolish jokes by this one. "John Kennedy runs to his mother at night. 'Mama, mama, help. Bobby tries to run my country.'" I think it was at that time that I told Lee that I had known Jacqueline Kennedy as a young girl, as well as her mother, father, and all her relatives, and how charming the whole family was. I especially liked Black Jack Bouvier, Jackie's father, a delightful Casanova of the Wall Street. Lee was not jealous of Kennedy's and Bouvier's wealth and did not envy their social positions. Of that I was sure. To him, wealth and society were big jokes, but he did not resent them. Now I want to tell something which may seem foolish to people who are not dog lovers. At the time, we had two lovely black Manchester Terriers, Nero and his faithful wife, Poppea. Poppea. Nero had followed us on a long trip over the mountains of Mexico and Central America and saved our lives on several occasions. Poppea was bought for him upon our return to the USA and was a wonderful wife for him. I cannot tell how much intuition Nero developed during our trip and how easily he recognized friends from enemies. Well, on the first evening, our dogs did not express any interest in Marina or Baby June, but they were fascinated by Lee. Nero especially showed him complete confidence and affection for him. He seldom did it with anyone, even our close friends. He snugged up to Lee and looked at him with affection. He sensed that he was an utterly sincere person and was deprived of hatred. Poppea also licked his hand in a rare display of affection. Incidentally, many of our friends and even our own children complained that our dogs were either unfriendly or totally indifferent to them. And so Lee finally found a job at Taggart's reproduction company through the Texas Employment Agency without help from anyone. It was a good job for him as he had been interested in photography for a long time. I guessed that he took a course at the Marine Corps. Anyway, he brought a good camera from the Soviet Union and took excellent pictures. Later, he showed me excellent enlargements he made himself. These were in black and white. He was not advanced enough to develop and enlarge color photographs. But Lee's job did not pay well, and as began to trust more and more, he accepted an introduction to a successful businessman banker, Sam Ballin, who owned, among other companies, a large reproduction outfit for maps, electric logs, and records. It was not a successful meeting. Lee and my friend did not like each other. To the businessman, Lee was a radical and a maverick, and Lee considered Sam an ordinary bourgeois with no redeeming features to his credit. Actually, both were interesting people, they just did not appeal to each other. After a conversation comes to mind, one evening Lee was in a blue mood and confided that he was not particularly pleased with his reception in Minsk. Somewhat naively, he had expected to be treated as a special person, a prominent refugee, and nothing happened. There was little difference between his condition in Minsk and that of an ordinary Soviet worker, and so he had become depressed. That evening, Lee expressed an opinion that he did not appreciate the Soviet type of government. Why, I asked. It is somewhat too regimented for me, he said. We were obliged to go to the meeting at the factory after work, dead tired, and listen to inflammatory speeches. It was lucky if I was able to go to sleep. Indoctrination of any kind are not to my taste. I saw his point. Our first evenings with the Oswalds were spent in conversations and discussions, and we got to know each other very well. Now, something else happened in our relationship. Before Lee got his job at Taggart's, I asked my daughter Alex and my son-in-law Gary Taylor to help the Oswalds moving to Dallas. The Taylors went to visit Oswald's in Fort Worth, and right there they offered Marina to stay with them and to keep the baby. Whatever furniture they had would be stored in their garage. This generous proposition was accepted. Marina moved to Dallas. Lee stayed for a short time in the apartment in Fort Worth and then moved to a small room at the YMCA in Dallas. Close to his work at Taggart's during Marina's stay at my daughter's place, my wife helped her, drove her to Baylor Hospital where they pulled out her rotten teeth. Baby June was kept healthy and well fed, but this short separation did not prevent Lee from coming to see us, even alone. Further conversation with Lee in 1962. At the time we knew Lee, nothing could be further from our minds that he might become such a historical figure. His visits were very frequent. Sometimes he would come for a short time. Sometimes he would spend the whole evening with us. Some bribes of our semi-bantering, semi-serious repartees remain in my memory. "You're an extremely sincere person, Lee," I told him. "You do not lie, even to yourself. Most of the people I know are the opposite of you. They put up a front, they confuse, they deceive, they lie even when thinking. I guess it's dangerous to be that way. I know I make a lot of enemies, but what the hell," he acknowledged. "My position is that I'm afraid of very few things in life. I am not cautious. I am not." He smiled. "A turkey which lives only to become fat." And he showed me his non-existing belly. He was becoming very thin. Lee, your way of life is so un-American, it scares me to think what may become of you. It is true, Lee said. I am probably committing a sin in not being interested in possessions or money. When a rich man dies, he is loaded with possessions like a prisoner with chains. I will die free. Death will be easy for me. Stop talking about death. You're only 22. If you want to talk about gruesome subjects, let me tell you this joke. A usurer is on his deathbed. A priest gives him a crucifix to kiss and confess his sins. And the usurer blabs, I cannot loan you much money for this. Regarding your attitude on money amidst possessions, I said I couldn't agree more with you. You would rather do something unusual than drive a Cadillac. I am the same way. Life for me, continued Lee, is like a hungry crocodile. I better defend myself. I have to defend myself against the stupidity of this world. It is enormous. Life must be the work of a perfect idiot, or maybe the stupid, like breaking of the atom. It's self-perpetuating. Not too bad for a 22-year-old American proletarian and a high school dropout, I thought. Lee, you have a very original mind. Thank you, he said. I do not often hear compliments, but let me tell you more why I despise money-loving middle class. Such people are simply stupid, not serious. They are curiously attracted by crooks and adventurers, and so you hear how often they are sheared off their wook like sheep by various financial schemers. Diderot, I said, thinks very much like you. You have nothing. And then it cuts off. Have very little now, so a real friendship is possible between us. We are sincere with each other. Lee agreed. Another thing Diderot said, I continued, he was very happy being poor and living in a shack. When he achieved opulence and found a nice apartment in Paris, he knew he was going to die. The philosophers talk, but you did it, said Lee enviously. This trip of yours. What a freedom, 3,600 miles on foot, on tough trails of Latin America. This demanded a complete change in his life, willingly, suddenly. For this, you needed an extraordinary moral audacity. This time I want to thank you, Lee, but do not exaggerate. This was an act of desperation rather than audacity, after the death of my only son. Finally, this trip was very satisfying to Jean and me. And so we chatted in an open and friendly manner, and I must of Lee. My opinion of this guy changes completely and frequently, which happens only with people who are close and important to me. I usually judge the others superficially and label them all once for all. But now I should explain the reason why I had introduced the Oswalds to my daughter Alex and her husband. They were about the same age. Gary was a scatterbrained, simple-minded, but pleasant young man. As most of his financial schemes failed, he had plenty of time on his hands. His fondest ambition consisted of becoming rapidly another Clint Murchison or H.L. Hunt, and that was hard to achieve. Frankly, I hoped that my daughter and her husband Gary would acquire some of the worldwide interests that Lee certainly possessed. His serious approach to life contrasted sharply with the foolish flippancy of Gary's. I also hoped that Marina would teach my daughter some interesting facts about Russia. When these two were together, they were somehow able to communicate, as my daughter was an excellent linguist. But introducing people of such different backgrounds led to an unpleasant result. First of all, we caused a separation between Marina and Lee. We did understand that it was not the first separation between them, but we actually caused this one. It amazed my daughter that Lee called Marina on the phone infrequently and did not express much desire to be with her. But he missed baby June. It was peculiar for a young husband, but I already suspected that he was pleased being alone at the YMCA and was already bored with Marina's company. Next, the personalities of Lee and Gary clashed. Lee considered Gary a spoiled rich American, foolish youngster, and Gary looked down at him as supercilious, unpractical lunatic with revolutionary ideas. My daughter's opinion of Marina was low also. She was slovenly and didn't know anything about baby care, although she had obtained a degree as a registered pharmacist in the USSR. My daughter's opinion of Lee was low also. He was not good-looking, did not care about his appearance. Neither was he inclined to make money. As for me, I regretted that Alex did not see any qualities. I liked in Lee the fact that he was socially motivated, was a dreamer and seeker of truth. But such people was a very hard time in life, and that's why so many people considered him a failure and a loser, in quotation marks. Maybe if he had lived longer, he would have fitted better into the scheme of American life. He would have joined a group of love children, would have grown a beard, and certainly would have been among protesters against the war in Vietnam. It was probably Marina, dissatisfied with my daughter's attitude, who made Lee hustle and find an apartment. Very soon the Oswalds settled in on their own ground floor apartment on Elspeth Street in Oak Cliff, suburb of Dallas. It was far away from us, while we wanted them to live nearby. Probably Lee wanted to be as far away as possible from other Russian refugees whom he disliked. Anyway, the apartment was 10 miles or more from our place at University Park. With Lee's job secured at Taggart's and away from the gruesome slum in Fort Worth, Jeannie and I thought that Oswald's family would be happy. Jean registered the baby in children's clinics for regular checkups, and Marina was treated almost gratis in the dental clinic of the Baylor Hospital. This involved long trips for Jean to drive back and forth, but she did not mind. Staying so far away from anyone put Marina in a condition of total dependency on Lee, since she could not communicate with anyone around. We were the only source she could understand. To invite the couple for dinner, we drove back and forth, almost 40 miles for a 4-way trip. Jean became quite close to Marina at the time, while Lee and I saw each other frequently. Soon, however, these trips became difficult for us as we both became busy in our professions, yet we wanted to continue seeing the Oswalds. One solution would be for them to buy some second-hand car, but Lee did not know how to drive, nor did Marina, of course. I did not doubt Lee's word. I mention this here because later Lee's lack of driving ability became a controversial issue. I believed him because I knew about the abject poverty of his childhood in New Orleans. In these prosperous United States, Lee's family occupied a position at the poverty line similar to blacks or poor Mexican Americans. Due to my wife's help, Marina's 4 spoiled teeth were removed and her system was not poisoned by them anymore. Baby June became healthy also. The Russian colony collected a small amount of money for Marina and the care of baby June. Lee did not know about it. He would not have accepted any charity since it was done recently. I think Jean handled the operation, and Marina spent nights in the house while the next morning Jean would drive her to Baylor Dental Clinic or to the child care center. An amazing incident happened on the way to Baylor, recalls my wife. She had to drive by the predominantly section of town, gaudy but fearful hall in Washington Streets, almost every decrepit house lodging, either a nightclub, striptease joint, or dance hall, hookers and flashy pimps strolling along the broken pavements. Suddenly, Marina excitedly attracted my wife's attention, shouting in Russian to slow down. She looked at the tall, muscled, young black youngster standing proudly at the corner and surveying the situation. "Look at him, look," she pulled my wife's sleeve in a frenzy. "What a handsome man." "Oh, yes," agreed Jean. "He is very handsome." "No, he is fantastic, fantastic," exulted Marina. Such an enthusiasm surprised my wife. "He's so big and strong, what muscles he must have." And my wife related this incident. She observed that it was not a question of an attraction of a Nordic woman to an exotic man of a dark race, but a distressing fact that a young married woman with a child would show such uninhibited admiration for a sexy male. I drove her myself on the same street and teased her myself about the attraction to black men. "Marina, I guessed you did not see in Russia such uninhibited natural men." She laughed. "Neither Russians nor American whites can compare to such beautiful men," she said candidly. "Maybe the Cubans I met in Minsk were just as attractive." The Oswalds in Minsk. The stories related by Lee and Marina about Minsk were especially interesting to me. It seemed that Lee was very unhappy at the beginning of his stay, and he even tried to slash his wrists out of despair. Since he was supposed to have done it already in Moscow in order to obtain a permit to remain in the Soviet Union, the wrist slashing became somewhat of a habit, if not subterfuge, with him. Marina held the job of a pharmacist in the hospital where Lee was treated. She took care of him, flirted with him very nicely, and began conquering his heart. Later, he polyps problem, and so he kept going on to the same hospital. I don't know what his spelling here is. And that's how the romance began and flourished. Marina came from a fairly good family, and from our point of view, since her father belonged to a former Tsarist group. It says T-H-A-R. It has to be Tsarist officer group. After his death, her mother married a man called Prusakov. Later, her mother died, and Marina got tired of living with her stepfather and her half-brothers and sisters, and so she decided to move from Smolensk to Minsk, where she received soon a degree of a registered pharmacist. I remember Marina's amusing repartee when I asked her if she liked her half-brothers and sisters. They were good, normal children, not like me. I was a bad one, and she laughed, showing a good sense of humor and a great deal of charm. After the hospital meetings, Lee and Marina began going out together to dances and movies, and eventually the relationship of affection and love developed between them. I remember looking at the new apartment building near the river Svislak, reminisced Marina. But only high technical and political personnel lived there, as well as some foreigners, Lee among them. It was a wonderful setting for a Soviet romance love, an American refugee, a river, and a new apartment building. Actually, the building belonged to the factory where Lee worked at the time. His staying there was no particular favor. But for a girl who had lived in crowded rooms with a stepfather and several children, this new house seemed a real paradise. And so they married and moved to that apartment building. Why did she marry him? She could have cohabitated with him. This happened frequently with young couples in Russia. The reasons are unknown to me and known only to Marina. Love, pity, or desire to come to the United States, probably the latter. As soon after their wedding, Lee decided that he wanted to go back to the U.S. He traveled to Moscow without a permit, went to the United States Embassy, got back his passport, and borrowed their $500 for the return. While in Texas, he paid religiously back each month's installments due on that loan. Marina frequently complained that he was too punctual in his payments, but he was. I ask you where to find another man in Lee's position on the verge of starvation who would be in such a hurry to repay a government loan, which would be very difficult to collect from a poor man like Lee, but somehow Lee felt this obligation very sincerely. Another question puzzled and still puzzles us. How come the Soviets permitted Marina to leave her homeland so easily, while it was hard for Lee to obtain a permit to leave USSR? He had to make another trip to Moscow to arrange it. And he never explained to me clearly how he got the permit to take Marina along. Well, I did it, Lee smirked, because all bureaucrats all over the world are stupid. Marina had an uncle, a colonel of a special forces NKVD, KGB today, Department of Interior, called Medvedev. I think he was her mother's brother. For some time, she had lived with him in Smolensk, I think, and Lee told me that this important man was dead set against his niece marrying him. Later, something made him change his mind. We were not interested at the time in the whys and wherefores of the colonel's activity. Now it is too late to find out. Maybe this colonel, for his own reasons, helped his niece to get out of Russia. Possible it was a good riddance of Prusakova. Niece, possibly something else. The loyal, decrepit Russian refugees like Marina, only because her real father had been a pre-revolutionary officer or some czarist official. This matter was indifferent to us, and we did not inquire further. But the permission to leave USSR was puzzling to us, uncle or no uncle, because we knew of many cases of Americans who never obtained a permit to leave Russia for their Soviet wives. Personally, I know of one case. One of the reporters of the Christian Monitor successfully extracted his wife from Russia at the time of Stalin. One day, Jean asked Lee a straightforward question. Why did you decide to go to the USSR? Answer frankly. You risked never to return to your country. I was looking for an ideal, Lee answered sadly. And why did you decide to return there? Jean insisted. Because I did not find my ideal. Obviously, utopia does not exist. I could travel and change countries the rest of my life and never find it. We liked this statement and agreed with Lee. We are becoming close friends. From time to time, my wife would prepare a special Russian or French dinner for the Oswalds, always keeping in mind that both of them were underfurnished. And I would talk with Lee in the meantime, often late into the night, although he unquestionably had some unpleasant experiences, as the slashing of his wrists proved. Lee was never hostile or emotionally upset about his life in the Soviet Union. He spoke of his co-workers humbly and engagingly. They were hospitable, friendly, and sincere. They invited me to their homes, fed me from their meager supplies, and we discussed all the subjects frankly, as we do it here. Did they tell you any jokes about their regime, I asked. Here's one I remember, Lee said. An American worker comes to the Soviet Union and he sees big apartment complexes. He asks, to whom do they belong? To the state, comes the answer. How about these factories and the big black cars? They belong to the state also. Then Lee smiled. The Russian worker comes to visit the United States, and he asks, these huge factories, to whom do they belong? To the capitalists, comes the fast answer. Aha, says the Russian, this is terrible. Then he notices nice suburban homes, new cars, and he asks, to whom do these belong? To the workers, comes an immediate answer. Then I asked Lee, did you ever hear about the one about a Soviet worker who was wandering from one factory to another asking, is there a place that would pay as little work I intended to do? Lee did not laugh. That is a rather vicious joke. Soviet workers work almost as hard as here, and certainly they get paid much less. Then he reminisced. Nobody in the Soviet Union tried to intimidate me or influence me, but I encounter these tendencies here. Nobody ever tried to make a communist out of me. I was sympathized, but I never joined a party. He's probably on the level, I thought. And what were your living conditions there, I asked. Not bad at all. Ample meals, clean surroundings, good companionship, and the pay. Sufficient. The apartment cost me 5% of my pay, and I don't eat much, as you know. With Marines, additional salary, we could manage quite well. Expensive but adequate, and I am not interested, as you know, in stylish clothes, of course. The Cubans dressed to kill, he smiled. Marina must have missed good clothes there, I thought. And how about transportation, I asked. Of course, I could not afford a motorcycle, but I liked to walk, and the public transportation was cheap and good. That was most annoying to you in the Soviet Union, asked Jean, who was listening in. Those endless meetings we had to attend after work, listening to those deadly monotonous speeches. You were lucky if you were in the back and you could take a nap. We listened to those bureaucratic outpourings, half-dazed, like children during a very boring lesson. Then we noted rather indifferently on various trivial issues. Later we would file out exhausted and we would return home. And Lee smiled. We never received any extra pay for the hours lost, and we certainly deserved it. I approved his attitude, nodding agreement. I would also hate to waste my time on such meetings. Lee spoke of other foreigners living there, some Cubans whose names I forgot. One family of refugees from Argentina. The family was an experienced engineer, and Lee had great respect for him. It wasn't once that he mentioned this family to me, talking mainly of the daughters who were so pretty and so friendly to him. All in all, Lee spoke frequently to me of his interest in women, and he even bragged amusingly and somewhat naively of his conquests in Russia. Here in the United States, Lee wasn't certainly a ladies' man. He felt depressed and confined. I think he frequently regretted having left Minsk. But there I can visualize him cutting a path of Casanova among the Russian women. And why not? He was a foreigner. He acted freely. He looked pleasantly, and his interest in Russian people was warm and genuine. Marina admitted herself one day he was something out of the ordinary. He looked like an American. He was easygoing, loose and alert, not like the other guys. That Lee was a perfect, normal, and well-adjusted individual in Minsk, Marina insisted frequently. The only trouble with him was he's interested in books, serious books, politics, discussions, rather than sex. Maybe it is not nice to talk about confidential sex matters between the Oswalds, but might as well do it. They show light on the personalities of this interesting couple. Marina was close enough to my wife to be completely open with her. Lee does not have sex with me, but rarely, she admitted, very rarely, about once a month. He is in such a hurry, poor fellow, that I do not get any satisfaction. It is most frustrating. When Jean repeated the matter to me, I laughed and told Marina a well-known Texas joke, translating it probably for the first time into Russian. Mandy was a good-looking black prostitute. A handsome, tall black by the name of Rostas came to see her. How much do you charge, Mandy? For $15, that does it all. For $10, we does it. For $5, you do it all. Rastus had only $5, so they agreed and went to bed, but a while later, Rastus began making love to Mandy, and he turned out to be such a formidable male that in ecstasy, Mandy wailed, Rastus, I shall do it all on credit. You have such an honest face. Naturally, in Russian, it did not sound very hot, but we all laughed, and possibly it was the beginning of Marina's ardent interest in our racial minority, the blacks. But aside from such foolishness, we talked with Oswalds of their lives in the Soviet Union, and soon we acquired a certainty that Marina wanted a richer and materialistically more rewarding life than one she had at home, and it was she who convinced Lee to go to the American Embassy to ask for the return of his passport and for money, all this in view to go home with him to the United States. Another interesting fact, the first time he went to Minsk from Leningrad or Moscow, he did it illegally. But the second time, he obtained a legal Soviet permit to go there by train. As a foreigner, Lee was not supposed to leave town without notifying the police and obtaining a permit. Not an easy matter for some of the people who had tried to leave Russia. I remember Marina telling me without any emotion that she had been discharged at the time from the Komsomol, the Organization of Communist Youth, and that it had happened because she married an American. In the Soviet Union, it was a disgrace, but she did not attach any importance to it while in Minsk, because obviously she knew she would leave her country anyway. Both Lee and I laughed about her naive belief that the streets of the United States were paved with gold and that poor people were the ones who had to wash themselves their Cadillacs. I remember Lee telling us a joke which circulated at the time among the young Russians. Capitalism to them meant champagne, luxurious cars, jazz, caviar for dinner, and Gina Lollobrigida for a girlfriend. Marvelous. Communism to them meant vodka, dirty tramway, balaleka, black bread, and their own mother. Marina laughed good-naturedly. Very often people ask me with suspicion why I, a person with several university degrees and a fairly good financial and social standing, with friends among the rich of the world, became such a friend of that inadjusted radical Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, I hope this book clarifies Lee's personality and endows him with a lot more attractive features. I already spoke of his straightforward and relaxing personality, of his honesty or his desire to be liked and appreciated, and I believe it is a privilege of an older age not to give a damn what others think of you. I choose my friends just because they appeal to me, and Lee did. It never occurred to me that he might be an agent of any country, including the United States, although he might have been trained in Russia for some ulterior motive. Lee was too outspoken, naively so. In this way, I was similar to him. In 1946, I was working in Venezuela for William Buckley's family company, Pantepec Oil Company. I met the Soviet ambassador there, who had been, before World War I, a roustabout for noble oil interests, and my uncle was a director of that outfit. So the ambassador knew my name and was extremely friendly to me. We spent many an evening talking and drinking vodka. As a result, he suggested he would offer me a contract to work in the Soviet Union. But after listening to me and my outspoken opinions, he advised, "My friend, you talk too much. You criticize too much. You would be a babe in the woods in my country and would end up in Siberia." Also, Lee was very interested in other people, in their work. He tried to improve his own education by reading, observing, and studying. Sometimes he was amusing when he used long, difficult words in English. Words like charisma, politicomania, extravaganzas, elitism, the knowledge of which he liked to display. We even laughed together about his use of such words, but the exact meaning of which eluded him. Occasionally, Lee's constant search for truth, for the answers to the mysteries of life, seemed tragic and disturbing to me. But this proves also that it seems highly improbable that any government would try to make an agent of such a man. His own element of self-inquiry, self-denial, and self-doubt mixed with instability worried Lee. But I told him not to worry. In my opinion, instability, doubt, constant search were elements of youth were indicative of exuberant life. I told Lee that I pitied people who did not possess such characteristics. Were living dead, they formed the mass of obedient slaves in all countries. A strong desire for adventure was also one of Lee's motivations. That's why he became a Marine. That's why he switched jobs, just because he did, not like what he had to do so far, and routinely was deadly to him. However, his last job at the printing company fitted him well, and he seemed fairly happy. "Why didn't you stay in the Marine Corps?" I asked him one day. "Oh, I did not care for the military, not much being an underling, not much adventuring there." "You could become an officer. You are intelligent enough," I countered. "Oh, no, to hell with being an officer. I don't like to command other guys." Often I was asked with suspicion, long before the assassination, "How did you get along so well with Lee Oswald?" In my life, I have done many things. I was often a promoter and originator of new ideas, so I liked new ideas, even if they seemed strange and outlandish. I enjoyed meeting people of various types, evaluated their thoughts, and did not criticize them. I retorted, Later on, when I was in the hot water because of my friendship with Lee, a friend of mine testified, George always liked stray dogs and stray people. Many people considered Lee a miserable misfit, an insult to the American way of life, and completely disregarded him. A Russian refugee living in Dallas told me once, "I'm scared of this man Oswald. He is a paranoid." Paranoid or not, he is as intelligent as you are. Listen to him. There is a lot of sense in what he says, I would reply. Probably to annoy Lee, the Russian refugees and some ultra-conservative Americans showered Marina with gifts and gave her too much attention. Since Americans could not communicate with her, their efforts were wasted, but these gifts given to his wife by the refugees annoyed Lee. Unquestionably, Marina added oil to the fire, bragging about the gifts and talking how successful some of the donors were, owning their own homes and 2 automobiles. He might have been wounded in his pride, although he never complained to me. At the time, Lee did not want Marina to learn English. She could only say yes and no, and if she went to the store, she had to point out the articles she wanted. "It's very egotistical on your part, Lee," Jean told him. "You have to let her study English so she can communicate with other people rather than Russian refugees. You cannot keep her here a recluse." Sensing that Lee resented them, the members of the Russian colony gave Marina some 100 dresses. Baby June received a new crib, carriage, and a lot of toys. Unquestionably, it annoyed Lee. The more people gave Marina, the more it disturbed Lee. Disturbed is not the right word, maddened. And so he declined invitations to these benefactors' homes. He was so often rude to them. That situation had very sad consequences for his family. As far as we are concerned, we continued our good relationship with the Oswalds, even after the situation in Soviet Russia and in Minsk, especially have been thoroughly discussed. Instead of questioning them, we became concerned in the welfare of this couple. "Be nice to the poor" was always Jean's motto. Seeing that Lee's situation was also gradually deteriorating, I became even nicer to him. Never kick a man who was down, help him was my belief. Sometimes Lee's actions and his sensitivities annoyed me, but I did not try to show any resentment and attempted to find a solution for him and his wife. All right. That brings us to the next section, contrasts between the Oswalds. And I'm actually kind of enjoying this. I don't know how much of it I believe, because you have to remember, obviously, George de Mohrenschildt works with the CIA. Okay? He's connected to all the White Russians in Dallas. He's connected to the mayor of Dallas, if you caught that he was friends with Cabell, the mayor of Dallas, right? And so he works for the CIA, and he's also friends with the mayor of Dallas, whose brother's one of the top guys in the CIA. Give me a fucking break. This is all set up. He's a handler. George de Mohrenschildt is a handler. So whether or not he's perpetuating... I bet you there's a kernel of truth in all this stuff. But is it true? I don't think so. I don't think so. He's perpetuating the story of Oswald being this communist fucking sympathizer. It's ridiculous. But we shall pick up here tomorrow. I will have another episode out today of Bloody History World War II, available on Substack. The link is in the description. I'd really appreciate if you guys would sign up for that. I'm going to be transitioning and shifting from Kennedy work to World War II and Holocaust work. This transition will take several years, so there won't be any changes anytime soon. But I figure within 24 months, my focus will be, 75% Holocaust, 25% Kennedy. And so please start this journey with me on Substack. bloodyhistory.substack.com. And I'm going to clarify what happened during World War II, the events leading up to it, and everything that's happened since, and how it's impacting our world today. So, as usual, buy the book, all that stuff. Give me your money, the whole 9 yards. I hate the fucking marketing aspect of what I do, but I have to do it. So, it is what it is. And that's going to do it for me today. I'll be back tomorrow, where we will continue with this manuscript. Thanks, guys.